in some mic or something? Yes.
Okay, now I'm technologically enhanced. Yes. Wonderful to be here. I literally traveled a third around the Earth's circumference to come here, and the conversations already has made it worth it. I'm going to do a very quick talk, because we're always running out of time, mostly to point out some things that we later might want to think about a bit more deeply. So, okay, here it is. So, this is a project that is basically a book I'm writing together with Professor Cyril Holm over in Sweden. And it began back in 2020, during lockdown, when we started thinking about state power, how to handle disasters, emerging technologies, singletons, and the role of AI. How would a pandemic be handled in a world with artificial superintelligence? And would we like that handling? So, this is a 45-minute talk I'm going to try to do in 15 minutes, so I try to summarize it. So the first question is, why do we have laws? This is a typical question law professors, or at least jurisprudence professors, really want to know. And the simple answer is, they're a way of coordinating us so we get peace and prosperity and power to some people. And that solves a lot of very hard problems, because it's actually hard to be a human. We need to solve complicated coordination problems in society. Many of them involve agents that like to break the rules or are very clever at doing it, so we construct systems that do that. So when we started, we called them singletons. Most of you probably have heard about Nick Bostrom's paper about singletons, where he's talking about orders that run the entire world, kind of central agents that could really avoid existential risk, because it could actually force everybody on planet Earth to do whatever is decided by the singleton. But we can imagine the lowercase s singletons. And then we realized that that was confusing, so we used this slightly awkward acronym, GUIDES, Globally Unique Decision Entities. But the legal system is like that. You usually have only one legal system per country. You usually have only one market per country. Very interesting exceptions and complications. But these orders are very effective. And they're also powered by human autonomous action. We do things, and every action actually is part of what the market and legal order is doing. And this is a very beautiful form of distributed cognition, and one can write entire books about it. And this idea is not new to us by any means. We can certainly go back to Hayek and von Mises. We can certainly bring up essentially standard sociology textbooks, etc. Now, one interesting thing is designing such systems from the ground up is very hard. The classic example of how this can totally fail is planned economies. The centrally planned economy has failed as an implementation everywhere where it's been tried, almost. And that is interesting, because if it's impossible to do that kind of big orders artificially, maybe AI can't do it either. If you take von Mises and Hayek's arguments against central planning seriously, it seems like the singleton, super intelligent entity that runs the world skillfully must be impossible, which is a quite interesting claim. Now, we try to figure things out about that, and it turns out that the situation is a bit more complicated. Now, generally, again, we know that existential risk must be a very strong drive to want to have very powerful coordination on a global scale. And it seems like AI and AI-supported social orders might actually be good at doing this. At the same time, you get this flight that, wait a minute, are we trying to design these big systems? Given how badly we know organized guides have failed in the past, we might not want to do that. But it seems plausible that if we're successful with aligning general intelligence, and we get a lot of action and cognition on tap, many of the coordination problems should be much more solvable. So that's the good news. We might end up with replacements of these extended cognitive system that we call guides, that are currently run between human minds and on pieces of paper, and now it's all running in software, and it's much faster, unbiased, effective, and we get way more peace and prosperity. Yes. And then there is that problem that human autonomy is no longer needed in this equation. That is very, very scary. Because it might be that we get a very wonderful future, but there is actually no need for autonomous action. Even autonomous action might be a stupid thing to do because it's always going to be suboptimal compared to the superintelligence. At which point we end up with this kind of serfdom conclusion. Uh-oh, this sounds very wrong. So the final part of our book project is trying to figure out a way around this. Both, is it possible? Could it be that there are actually real limitations of what superintelligence can achieve in the actual complicated world? Because there might be limits on how smart you can be. But also, can we now, before we have superintelligence, design things and set up not just alignment so we can survive having powerful systems around, but setting up alignment in such a way that is aligned with a good social order, that it's aligned with human autonomy? And the answer is an interested maybe. Okay, that was the summary of my talk. Hopefully now you can follow the rest, because I'm just going to flip through a lot of slides, just making a brief point about what we're talking about. Basically, it's a funny book for me because I'm in the ethics business, and we're ignoring ethics. This has to do with the Swedish legal tradition that got interested in this idea that actually using error theory, saying that all talk about ethics is irrelevant, actually makes for very good ways of thinking about law. And this is useful when you're trying to argue about stuff that feels very normative and ethical. Because if we can show things without recourse to bringing in ethics, it might work for the people who actually believe that there are ethical systems in the world. Now, the interesting part here is that to note that we're very normative animals. We really like following rules, and if somebody tells you when you're young, very solemn and sternly that you ought to do something, you quite often think that you ought to do it. It has a strange power on us. And even if you think that actually there is no ethics other than as a research topic, those normative claims have great power in making us do certain things. Not just in the sense that it's smart to follow the social norms of driving on the right side of the road, but also that you actually think that there is something inherently wrong with stealing. And that means that since many people think that, we don't steal very much and we get a very low friction society with high trust. So generally, the kind of beings we are have this problem that we're stupid and selfish, but we're also very good at coordinating, and we need to coordinate better. As Eleanor Ostrom showed, we solve very hard coordination problems by inventing little social institutions, sometimes very obscure ones. And we quite often make these pragmatic epistemic guidelines, these heuristics that make society and our thinking work. And they shape our behavior way more than we normally think. And that is probably, if you leave out the idea that there is some actual moral reality out there, this is actually what is going on. We create these normative orders, and they power a lot of what we're doing. Now, of course, some people are very good at hijacking this. This is an important problem with designing systems like this, because there are always going to be some people who are thinking, how can I maximize my outcome? But the really interesting thing, we end up with this iceberg. We have a little top of the iceberg where we have our explicit laws, our explicit rules, and under the surface we have all these norms and systems. We have the power of a market which self-organizes. We have a lot of the implementation of law, which doesn't happen through court and police, but actually through the little policeman in our head telling us, I should probably not be doing that. And these designed and non-designed structures work sometimes very well, sometimes they fail disastrously. The interesting thing here is that this system doesn't have to necessarily reside in just brains. We can take the extended mind hypothesis serious and say, actually, a lot of it literally happens on the pieces of paper we carry in our pockets and bookshelves. A lot of it happens in the form of online conversation between people engaging in a trade. We actually are already doing a lot of this in an inorganic form, which means that it's not that weird if other inorganic forms like software might be doing it. Certainly high-frequency trading is already doing it. We have outsourced a lot of our cognition to corporations that are basically machines that are implementing this extended cognition and sometimes doing it in ways that are very different from what any member in the organization would say. So now we end up with the guides, these natural intelligence systems, and they are very useful, very powerful cognitive artifacts. Also potentially very deadly ones, as we see through wars and democides. But we're all powered by our human individual actions. And then you get these emergent powers from it. That's great. And as I mentioned, we have this little problem with planning. As a computer scientist, I immediately felt like, yeah, those nice arguments by Hayek and Mises who planned the economies couldn't work from the 20s and 30s. They're nice, but I want to see the actual computational complexity. Suppose I wanted to run an economy, how hard could it be? Can I actually run it on my computer? And it turns out that if you do the best possible assumptions, let's assume we want to allocate goods and services as a linear programming problem. So we're assuming, oops, now this stopped. I lost my power allocation. Okay. Okay. Let's see.
Socialism doesn't work.
Yeah, it works.
Test.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that was just a slight hiccup in the 5-year plan of supplying units out. And historically, we of course know that these 5-year plans, these grand plans of allocating products fairly, didn't work very well in reality because reality was very complex. But it turns out that even if we assume everything is beautifully linear and turn it into a standard linear programming problem, the scaling with the problem size, the number of goods, is by the 2.5th power, give or take a little bit, given some theoretical issues. That turns out to be what the people in theoretical computer science would say, oh, that's a tractable problem. It's not exponential. And in practice, it turns out that it takes 54 million years to do a proper allocation of goods in the current modern economy, which is practically not what we want. And of course, you need to update this every time somebody invents any single new thing. That is a bit of a problem. There are ways of trying to get around this, but most of them don't work for various interesting reasons. So at this point, of course, I might be the smug liberal and saying, haha, I defeated socialism yet again, yay for the free market. Except, of course, that there are similar theorems that seem to apply if we try to think about markets. It should also be actually intractable. Indeed, there are some hilarious papers showing that if the efficient market hypothesis is true, even in its weak form, then P equals NP, at which point all computer scientists in the audience will go, wait a minute, that can't be right. So they conclude that the efficient market hypothesis must be wrong, which is actually fairly reasonable. But similarly, it turns out that price formation should take exponential time, but it doesn't. The price of this bottle of water probably converged very quickly and without much problem. What seems to be going on here is that this kind of distributed cognition going on in a market actually is very approximable. It's much easier to find a quick approximation that's good enough, and that actually works. The really interesting thing is, of course, when you start thinking about the theory of firms. Coase brought in this idea that why do we form companies and organizations? Well, there are these costs of making contracts. If we're all working as individual contractors, we're going to spend endless time negotiating contracts. That's tricky. It's easier that I negotiate a contract with somebody hiring me, and then we get something that works well. And that way, transaction costs are kept down, and everything is fine. And then the company can grow up until you get this economies of scale. What Herbert Simon pointed out was that the actual size of firm and their distribution is very sensitive to a lot of these assumptions. If you change the scalings, they might balloon or shrink a lot. And he also pointed out that much of economies are not at all a free market. It's actually a somewhat planned economy inside firms. In fact, the free market is solving some computational problems for big blobs that are not free markets. And we can, of course, bring up complexity economics as Cesar Hidalgo's work here, but I'm running out of time. The interesting point is, if we introduce AI, we might see some interesting changes in the scaling. And it's not entirely obvious to me whether this means that either firms implode. It's so easy for us to do contracting using smartphone apps that we're all gig workers. Or that Walmart grows to become 100% of the world economy, leaving both liberals and socialists looking like, oh, that's not what we wanted, but we have a global planned economy. Okay. Now, existential risk have been already mentioned, so I'm just going to be going through, jumping past that. Similarly, the world might, we're not certain, but it might be really vulnerable. And that, of course, leads to this worry that we really need global coordination. The classic idea is, of course, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. He felt like the war against everybody was so dangerous that we need even a bad ruler. And it's an interesting one because he actually, in his fantastic book, is even talking about that the body of a state is an artificial man. He's literally describing it as a machine. We would say, okay, he's totally talking about AI. He even got into kind of trouble for thinking about making artificial people in his writings. Then he would probably have been totally fine with a modern state too, with state capacity. Now, Nick Bostrom, as I mentioned, had this idea that to forestall existential risk, we also need some global coordination of some kind. Exactly what that is, whether that's United Nations plus or nano superintelligence, is kind of left open. It's still a very disturbing little paper, especially when you connect it to the urgency the vulnerable world hypothesis leads. Now, there are some really interesting cybernetic control problems with the singleton. We have an extensive critique of where we think it's totally actually failing as being possible. But we also have our alignment problems. And while the classical threat of a superintelligence taking over the world is one of them, there are more creeping ones where we might get somewhat aligned systems that then we use, but we get an emergent misbehavior that unfortunately poses existential risk. There are also disalignments that happen when human values get modified. I don't have the time to get into that, but basically we see that there is a problem here. There's a natural tendency where we might end up with a kind of AI singleton that we don't like, because we lose our autonomy. Of course, when I asked on Twitter to my followers, would you like to live like a pampered aristocrat but have no real autonomy because it's the aligned superintelligence running everything, 75% said yes. That was disturbing. Yes, and I'm running out of time. I would just like to point out, we quite often trade our autonomy to win things. Like now I'm trading my autonomy here to the moderator because I've been up on stage long enough. I'm just saying that there might be solutions. And we can discuss that way better afterwards. But right now, thank you so much for listening.